Well, greetings, Resident Evil fans of all shapes and sizes. So, I've of course reviewed every other Resident Evil film out there, live action and the CGI film Degeneration. And, of course, Resident Evil Damnation has now been released here in the States, and I, of course, ran out and picked it up. In fact, you can hear it, I'm holding it in my hands. So, what do I think of Damnation? I will agree, it is better than Degeneration, though it still suffers some flaws. And I'll explain what those flaws are. I think part of it is, well, let's say it outright. I think we have a film here that's been directed by a non-English speaking director who directed a movie in English, from what I understand. Director, let's see if I'm going to mispronounce this. Maybe not. Maybe I'll get lucky. Makoto Kamiya? Or Kamiya? Makoto Kamiya? Whatever. Makoto here. One, he doesn't have. I mean, he's got a lot of special effects, but this is his second film. His first film was, of course, Degeneration. Although I will give him credit. He seems to. I'm not sure if they either hired better technical people. I'm talking about like from authenticity standpoint. I think they did a little bit of that, but the script was written. This apparently wasn't written to be in English, even though it takes place in an Eastern European country. But it was written in English, and most of all the lines were read in English. And you have then a director who can't work out how certain lines just don't sound right when they're said. And then the other problem is you have apparently the motion capture actors who also did the voice, the handwork, or not the handwork, but did the motion capture for the face as well as the acting, were not the same as the voice actors, which I think was a mistake. In that, I think it would have been better to have Matthew Mercer there as opposed to having just stand-in kind of stunt people or body actors. You get a much better performance, and they did that with several other people in the movie. Pretty much all of the characters were voiced by somebody separate from who was doing the actual acting, which is fine for maybe minor characters in the background or considered extras. But you probably really wanted to do the voice acting with the physical acting. You get a much better performance, and I do criticize them for not doing that. I don't know why, whether it's because it's cheaper. I mean, Matthew Mercer is not the biggest star around. I mean, I like his stuff, his voice acting, and of course Damnation and his other voice work. He's done a ton of video games and such, but he can't be that expensive to have him come out and do. As I'm looking, he was Stryker as well in Mortal Kombat. Oh, sorry, I digressed. My point still stands. He's not the biggest actor. You should have been able to hire him and have him come down and perform. Same thing with just about all these other guys. There's no major name in here where you could say, well, we could afford him for 2 days or 2-3 days of voice work, but not 2-3 weeks of doing the action in a motion capture studio. Which, to me, again, I think that's the problem with Damnation. But they still did a better job than Degeneration. That's just kind of my point is going this. I think they really need to fix that one element. But enough about the good. Or enough about the bad. I'll get back into a little bit of the bad again. Let's get into some of the better improvements. One big one here. One of the biggest problems you can complain about Degeneration is the final fight takes forever with the G-Monster. And while the final action scenes, the final arc, are the last third of the movie is basically a giant action sequence. It has different stages, different unique stages to it, where you have... we're getting into some spoiler territory here, so be warned. You have Leon, they have... Well, first they have the fight with the president, which I'm going to get into in a bit. They have the fight with the president. Then you have Leon sneaking past the liquors and that scene. Them going down into the bunker, which we have a buffer then between that, where there's a bit of a quiet scene. You have the shootout with the Eastern Slav guards. Then you have the liquors, led by Buddy, come down and attack. Then you have the tyrant fight in the basement. They get out, and then you have the tyrant fight in the main palace grounds. And they tie this together much better by, again, making it an evolutionary. Things are changing. Instead of just having a G-monster wrecking stuff for however long, and having that ridiculous drop system, which, man, over-prepared. Now, there is a bit of a... Okay, the movie takes place in this Eastern Slav Republic, which is, first off, they might have well just called it fake Eastern European country. Eastern Slav Republic, really? That's one of the most generic names I could think of for a country. And we're kind of vague on where it was. I'm guessing Europe, but we'll get into the history, which is one of my... This is more of a nitpick from my perspective, but... Anyway, they're in that country, and they're in the equivalent of the Oval Office. The Oval Office is apparently in a giant elevator that they hit one button, it seals up, and it goes down this massive shaft, which still isn't... It's not as, kind of ridiculous as the giant drop shaft that can drop entire building complexes down. But it's still pretty far, and you're like, really? Really? Go down, there's a big bunker. There's a big bunker complex down there, although they kind of, at least, it's a more realistic looking bunker complex down there. And they kind of, even that, they kind of say it's an old bunker complex, implying that it was built by the Soviets, which you can buy a little bit more than just that they built this giant thing. You can go, okay, this is obviously, since they're an old Soviet bunker, it's still ridiculously deep into the ground, but you can kind of buy that this maybe was an important Soviet facility, and of course, since the place became independent, Russians aren't involved there, so they just built the palace over it. Or something along those lines. But it was a little ridiculous. I don't know, and the funny thing is, at some point they drop two tyrants down the elevator shaft. They get on the elevator at the bunker floor, and the thing still goes down further, and I go over to my friend, I'm like, where is that shaft going to? Did, they just have extra budget in the elevator, so they're like, well, fuck it, we still have about $4 million to build this elevator shaft, even though we've already reached the ground floor. We're just going to drill down deeper. We're just going to keep on building this until we run out of the elevator budget. Actually, that's probably how things ran in the Soviet Union. But yeah, it's like, we were given this much money to make elevator. We make elevator go down till we use up all the cash. Nitpick, I know. Anyway, let's get into the general plot. The plot, of course, is that the United States there's a civil war in the Eastern Slav Republic, which I already talked about. It's kind of a ridiculous name occurring, and there is reports of BOWs. So, of course, the government sends in Leon Kennedy, who they then almost immediately say, "No, Kennedy, you have to leave the country. We're pulling out all assets." Kennedy goes, "No." Goes on his adventure, shenanigans ensue. And this is kind of more of a nitpick, and I think this is kind of a criticism I have for a lot of times with Japanese writers, is they don't seem to be very good with grounding reality and figuring out how things kind of function in the world with kind of bigger political issues. Um, and that kind of has to do with the Eastern Slav. They're very. If you let a Japanese writer write a completely fictional world, they're normally kind of good. They can think of the internal politics, but if you make them do the real world, they kind of draw a blank. I don't know what's with it. What's with that? If it's something with, I guess, culturally with Japanese writer, where they're normally not as interested in the rest of the world, so they don't figure out how stuff works. So they just write in general what we would call tropes. Because there's a lot of contradictory things that you're trying to figure out what the hell is going on with this country, the Eastern Slav Republic, which again, super generic. And funny thing too is that they have the flag and it's got a French. It's not a tortellini, but the flower which you see on 1700s French flag was a sign of French nobility, kingdom. And I'm like, why is this on an ex-Soviet state flag? You can probably create a history where maybe the ancient duchess from this world married a member from the French royal family, and therefore they adopted that symbol as part of the old flag. So okay, I can kind of buy that. But they quite early, when you meet the president for the first time, she's talking to her prime minister, or her not a prime minister, but her staff. She's kind of saying we should have been part of the UN 5 years ago. I'm like, they state the movie takes place in 2010 or 2011. I forget which year. I think it was 2011. Was it 20? Either way, that's 20 years after the Soviet Union broke up. So for 15 years, I mean, is this an independent country or not? Does another country recognize this? Because it's not that hard to get recognized by the United Nations. Unless you have somebody actively opposing you, it's very easy. All the other former Soviet states recognized. I don't see why this isn't recognized. So I don't know why they're saying they're not part. If they wanted to say they wanted to be part of the European Union, that would be much more believable. And I think they mentioned the EU real quick, but I think they really messed up by saying the UN. It's like, really? Why? So you're not in the UN. You don't have observer status. You say we're a respected member of the international community. Even North Korea has representatives in the UN. And the only countries that aren't in the UN are claimed by other countries and are very, very small. You're talking about like a couple of states, areas in Georgia that the Georgian government doesn't control, but the Russian government supports for being independent. But they're very small. Countries like Chechnya, which actually is at this point completely dominated pretty much by the Russians. Eastern Moldova has a region that is kind of independent. I think Azerbaijan has a few areas that are kind of de facto run by rebel groups that are trying to claim and want to get recognized by the UN, but we're talking extremely small countries. And again, in almost every, and of course, how did I miss this one? Palestine, which many countries actually recognize in the UN, and there's been some recent push to try to make it an officially recognized UN country. And of course, again, in each time you need a country actively opposing it, the establishment of a nation. So who is opposing it? It's kind of made clear that no other countries are really involved in this little conflict. They're making it seem like the Civil War is making it not be recognized. It's confusing. They really should have made it the EU or some sort of economic union group or something. WHO, well, not WHO, but not the G20, because you have to be kind of big to be in the G20. But you could have anything other than the UN would have worked in this case, because unless it was really they were making it that the Russians were very actively opposing this country gaining independence, which would imply that it's not an independent nation, which gets then further complicated when they talk about the rebels. They say the rebels are fighting for independence, when in the prologue they kind of make it that the rebels are fighting for that the country became controlled by oligarchs. Very much classic Soviet breakdown. what happened in Russia. Basically, huge business because the Soviet Union. You went from having a communist country where the state owned everything to a country where they were going to do shock therapy capitalism, which turned out to be a horrible ideal because that meant you immediately started auctioning off everything the state owned in a country where there wasn't a capitalist tradition. Therefore, there wasn't a class of people that had access to funds to try to purchase and develop industries or to purchase these products. So what happened was, a few individuals that did have access to money, a lot of them associated with underground criminal networks, or already had massive controls within the Soviet state and had their own cash reserves as a result of that. Those were the ones that then bought all these assets and took them for themselves for dirt cheap. They were able to buy huge assets because the government had to liquidate almost everything, creating the oligarchs of Russia, which became a huge problem. They were, had a lot of problems with that, and that's really, if you want to know why Putin can kind of do the stuff he does in Russia, it's because he kind of made himself the enemy of the oligarchs, which to a lot of the Russian people was the thing they wanted because there was a lot of problems associated with this. Now that little history lesson is over, that's what they kind of implied that the Civil War is over, is the oligarchs were kind of controlling it, and this was kind of one of the things people had been fearing for years throughout the late 1990s, was that you were going to have something like this happen where you're going to have a revolution break out, the Civil War break out, almost like a class warfare type situation. And that's what it's told to us in the prologue. But then throughout the rest of the movie, they're calling themselves independence fighters, or I'm pro-independence, all that stuff, and you're like, independent from what? I thought you were fighting to overthrow the oligarchs. Now it's like rebel territory. So are they fighting to make part of the country independent, but it's not UN recognized or really recognized? They're kind of implying they're saying they're kind of an international pariah. I don't know why. They don't seem like they're a North Korea. So if they're not really recognized as a country by anybody, would it be really you're pro-independence, or you're fighting to become recognized? Or are they... I almost feel like there was rewrites here at points. I almost feel like there was some major rewrites at points on this script where certain elements got stuck in. And again, maybe if this again might be a problem with translation, where if there's a Japanese writer and they were translating stuff and they might have wanted a particular term used, and they might have been very persistent on this term, that independence, I don't know, maybe that means more of a freedom fighter type scenario. When in English, at least in American English, when you use independence as a political ideal, it means you're breaking away from something, not necessarily being political freedom. So I think, again, this goes back to, I think there was some problems with having a non-Japanese speaking director. I hope the writer knew enough about English, but again, it's one of those where independence from a dictionary perspective probably looks like a fine, and maybe from learning from foreign language, but if you, in the vernacular how it's used, it means something completely different when you're talking in a political context. So that's the kind of the setup, and then it gets further complicated with what is everyone kind of trying to accomplish. It's somewhat implied that somebody accidentally released a plaga. Well, do I want to even get into that right now, or do I want to get into... Well, here, we'll get into actually near the end of the movie. We're going to bounce around a bit, where we're told that Leon and Ada wind up both getting into like I described, the bunker underneath the presidential palace, and discover that, lo and behold, the government is creating bioweapons. The problem is, it's the rebel freedom fighters, or we'll just call them the rebels, or pro-independence fighters. We'll get into that character as well, but we'll just call them rebels. The rebels are already seen planning on using, and active. They're the ones that or at the beginning of the film, are using the bioweapons. We never see the government use bioweapons until after they're attacked with bioweapons. Which, again, I think they were shooting this to be kind of a more complicated political aspect, but I think this has something with Japanese storytelling. But I'll put in this: they get down in it and they find that there's a stockpile of cultivated master plage. And if you're unfamiliar with how this works, lost plages is a parasite where they kind of makes you kind of a zombie-like creature, not quite a full zombie though. You follow instructions from anyone that has what's called a master plaga. So if you have a master plaga, you can control everyone that has a plage. And I guess they're implying that the rebels purchase on the black market liquors with, I guess they injected both the liquor with a plage. That must be what they're implying they did. Or that they injected a gandos with however you make a liquor. And therefore they give themselves, I'm not sure if it's a full master plage because it's this little injection thing, and people seem to be turning after a while. When in Resident Evil 4, you didn't see, yeah, they would, if they got attacked and severely injured, they would mutate, but people were still fully into their capacities. Whatever the rebels are using, it seems like after a couple of, like, almost like a day's worth of use, you kind of just become another Gondo. So maybe I guess it's because they're using a black market. They're not using a fully, full version of the master plage. They're getting some sort of derivative, maybe something that simulates the master plage, but doesn't quite go all the way. But regardless, they storm underground into this bunker, and they have these cultivated master plages, which of course changes the game because now you can just grow the master plages. Before you could grow the regular ones, but it was very hard to find a master plage. Now you can just grow the master ones, which makes everything, which I think is going to tie into Resident Evil 6. But the government never unleashed these things. They're growing them, they're researching them. Obviously, Ada's got some information that that's what they're doing. And if they also apparently have some tyrants, huge tyrants too. I think these are the biggest tyrants we've ever seen in the series. Whether they developed them or they bought them from a more professional black market, we're not sure. But my point remains is that kind of at that point then it's shown as the government's the bad guys when the government hadn't used them. Now it is made some imply that the rebels again are attacking because there's support for these groups, or because of bad things the government's doing. But again, the rebels are the ones really in the streets using them, and it's somewhat implied that the rebels had the Gondos, and that they might have accidentally released them. That somebody got infected with the plage, and when they were using it, I think it was kind of implied that because they're using this derivative of the plages to control, I guess not a full master plage, but something that after a while is going to turn you into a regular Gondos. One of the rebel leaders must have accidentally, first one to realize this, turned fully into a regular Gondos and then started infecting everybody without a master to control it. Which, not a very good thing. But so the rebels are kind of the cause, and we're kind of following the rebels. We're supposed to be getting their points of view from this. Now, the movie does try to... the director has claimed that that there's not supposed to be a clear good guy, bad guy thing, but you don't really get that sense. I think he kind of failed in getting that aspect relayed. Because you feel like we're kind of being forced to sympathize with the rebels, even though they're the ones causing all the problems. At least as far as bioweapons. Now, maybe the war itself, and I think the one guy made a good point, is there's an artillery barrage going. The government's kind of just wiping out this entire section of the city, and he goes, to me, there's no difference between using bioweapons, or BOWs, and this being, just bombing everything in sight. It's like, really, what's the difference? And I think that's an interesting, good point. And a point that somebody would, and this is where you have some good writing, this is kind of the point that somebody would use. It's like, you're criticizing me for using this one particular means, but this is destructive too. And if we're fighting for our independence, and just because we can't get access to artillery, we have access to this stuff. And really, what's the difference? So why should we be criticized? Where's your blame? Where's your complaints on these guys? I like that. I think that was a good point to make in the film. But where should I go to next now in this review? Now that we've kind of established the political mess, like why is the government bad? Oh, and then of course at the very end, the U.S. and Russia, which again they really didn't. They established U.S. interest by Leon being there, and they kind of imply that the reason they were pulling him out in the beginning. Oh, I love this line. Was that Leon kind of went with, okay, the U.S. and Russia had the Eastern Slav Republic in the palm of its hand the entire time. That's why you were pulling me out. And they have his handler. She's like, Leon, no, that's not what happened. The president was completely unaware of this. I'm like, you're telling me the U.S. launched an invasion of an Eastern European country in full cooperation and coordination with the Russian army, and the president had no idea? And mind you, the movie only takes place over the course of about 2 days. Bullshits. Unless maybe if in Resident Evil 6 there's an element of the government that's kind of causing this, I call shenanigans. Like, I don't think, again, this is kind of like I say, Japanese writers not really understanding how things work outside of Japan, like how the rest of the world works. I'm not sure if that's just because there's not as much. Maybe, I don't know why. Is Japan kind of like the American Midwest, where they don't really care? We don't care about them other countries. We care about what goes on here. Like, okay, I know it's stereotypical to say everyone kind of from the Midwest or from the South is like that, but you kind of get my point. Is that a common thing within Japan where they don't care as much about how the rest of the world fully operates? So if you have somebody kind of writing about, if you had, if let's say you have literature from some sort of ignorant American writing about England, and then they make it so that they make it seem like the Queen has way more power than she actually does in real life, because she's supposedly the head of state. Therefore, she kind of rules, and she's able to make certain commands and stuff, and while recognizing it's a constitutional monarchy, not quite getting it. You can kind of if you kind of understand that underlying plot there. I think that's what you were seeing here, and it's an interesting thing to look at, because it seems to happen every time. Again, it's great when you don't notice this when Japanese writers are writing about a sci-fi setting or a fantasy setting, because it's its own rules. So you don't pick up on how, okay, well, yes, maybe this guy is elected and this guy is in a hereditary position. You buy it because it's a fictional world. This, on the other hand, is supposed to take place in the real world. And among the things that it's a hard time to accept it taking place in the real world is, and I said I was coming back to this, the president of this country. Now they make it a first female. Oh, it's the first female president. Oh, which is good. I think that's a good element of her name, because she becomes the big bad for this. Stavlanta Belikova. It's good that they bring her in as being like the villain, because you normally have this idea of a female politician being the first elected official. They're the good person. No, here they go the anti-trope. She's the ultimate villain. She's manipulative. She's in with all the business interests. She's the one having people killed behind their back. She's ordering all these horrible strikes and stuff, and using the military to crush all. She's doing the more stereotypical evil, dictator thing. And I love that. I give the writer credit for that. I give the writer and the director credit for that. But there's one scene where she's in there with Ada Wong, and Ada kind of does her kung fu thing, and then she all of a sudden reveals, no, the president is a master kung fu expert as well. Like, she's doing the crazy flips and crazy jumps all over the air, and you're like, Really? Really? Like, you laugh and you're like, oh, come on. Now, yes, I know Putin is a black belt in like two martial arts, and could I'll say this, if it was a death match of like every world leader, like stick him in an arena and you got to fight to death, Putin would probably win. But that doesn't mean that every Eastern European leader is a master martial artist. Like, she's doing stuff I don't think Putin could pull off half the crap she's doing. And it's kind of like, okay, just because you're a female in an action movie doesn't mean you have to be you can be the political villain. Or if they at least maybe had her just do a couple of simple moves, like, your experience, or you know what, even maybe had it more like she had a philosophy of like, maybe more of a nihilistic philosophy, like, or super social Darwinism. One that I could buy the whole genetics. Actually, that would have been a whole lot better to put into this movie, where she actually expressed some sort of early philosophy. You have to be like almost like a super soldier type thing. I would have bought. Oh, that's why she's having the tyrants. She's trying to develop all this stuff. Makes sense now. But no, they don't. It's quite clear. They kind of make it quite clear. They should have just left it as a political villain. Had Ada just fight a few of her bodyguards, beat them, and then kind of reveal her traps, and again, make her a villain of the mind. You didn't have to make her a strong female character, because the main person she's opposing in that fight is another female character. There's your strong female character. You can have realistic female over here now. You have your crazy character, and not that she's crazy. I'm just saying, from writing perspective, she's like, okay, there's your kind of stretching the realms of reality, which she does. Ada's always able to find a way out real easy, overly like, oh, I planned to get in here. They brought me down. Other characters, though, of course, in addition to the president, we've talked to Ada. She does her usual Ada thing, although they kind of imply that somewhere between Resident Evil 4 and this film, like Ada and Kennedy, or Leon, I should say, either ran into each other and maybe possibly had a little night of smoosh smoosh or something. There was implication that they may have met at another point, which is why I guess he wouldn't be surprised why she's not dead, because it does seem like every time, from his perspective, every time he runs into Ada, she dies. You have, of course, the character of Buddy, or Alexander Sashuk. I'm not going to try to pronounce the character's last name. He's kind of like the rebel leader. He's the character that kind of made the point. I don't see the difference. So we actually do have like a sympathetic terrorist here. We see him doing kind of horrible things, but we're not. Again, I think they kind of fail in this. Is we're not supposed to like the character, completely agree with them, but I think the movie's kind of forcing that on us. I think that's a bit of a flaw with this movie. Then other things, they make some. He's interesting, if somewhat generic, and kind of like the villain that kind of spiels. Although I will say, I've seen enough of Japanese anime to know he's kind of a villain, but we get his purpose. He's a rebel freedom fighter. He thinks if I take out this oligarch, we can have peace and freedom in the country. Much better than usual, the world is pain, and if I kill everyone in the world, there won't be any pain. Like Final Fantasy characters. They also give him, I think, a decent backstory, and in a way they end it with Leon just shooting the guy. Which, by the way, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about with Leon's character, since we're talking about characterizations. And I think this is partially because, again, this goes back to not having the actors do the voices, be the ones that do the motions. Leon's kind of a dick in this movie. Like, there's guys carrying, he like dying, and he's like, oh, I guess Scarecrow. Like, there's one guy who's contacted Scarecrow. He's like, he comes out of a corner. He's like, he's obviously torn up. He's like dying, trying to get his last words out. He's like, I guess scarecrows aren't much for talking. And you're like, really? You're saying that over this? This guy's obviously, he's not dead yet. Maybe it was one thing if the guy died and you'd be like, okay, that's his dry gallows humor, but the guy's dead, so he's not like he's being insulted. No, the guy's still like struggling to give his like last words, and he's like barely caring about the guy, just making like little quips about him. I'm like, that is a douche thing. That is a douche thing to do, sir. And they do later on where he comes across. He's in the presidential palace and he comes across a room and there's a couple liquors in there, and a soldier kind of like reaches out to grab like he's obviously reaching out not to grab like to grab Leon and try to stop him, but like I need help. And Leon's like, sorry, can't talk right now. And he runs off and he lets the liquors rip the guy apart. I'm like, again, kind of a douchey thing to say there. And then he does give a little speech about near the end, like Buddy wants to commit suicide because he's been ejected with the gun. He's now turning into a creature. I guess his character artist, he realizes it's not worth literally losing your humanity using these weapons, which is the underlying allegory. And Leon goes, "No, you have to live. You have to live because you owe that to everyone else that died. You can't just, once you pick up these arms and fight, you can't. You forfeit your right to end your life. You have to now carry on." And then Leon shoots him in the spine. They kill the Plage, yes, but I'm like, dude, you could have brought him to a hospital and had them remove the Plage. Shooting him in the spine, there's a good chance of removing the Plage, you're going to kill the person anyway. I think those chances go up if you decide to remove via bullet. It just kind of does him, like, really douche move, Leon. Well, they do show Leon as, again, being the super kung fu expert. And, of course, then there's JD. Since we're on characters, he's the comic relief, the guy like, we hate America, but we love everything made in it. The freedom fighter who, again, when he's dying, the last words is like, I never really believed in this independent stuff. I just wanted to have friends with you. I wanted to have fun with you and my friends. Like, great work to say, JD, that you never really believed in this cause you're now dying for. He's the comic relief. You're kind of wondering why he seems to be so high up with the rebels when he seems like this would be like, okay, cannon fodder. You go out in that street and run over by that tank now. Good boy. So, let's see, is there anything else? Yes, the final thing I was going to talk about. And we're going a little over on this one, aren't we? This is the first time we actually get to see the bioweapons used, or the BOWs used in actual warfare. And I think some of the director of this, I will give Makoto, I will give him credit. He's kind of a military buff himself. I think he's a self-confessed one. And I think he tried to show that, in reality, these weapons wouldn't be that effective with modern warfare, modern tactics. And one of the first things is when Ada's giving her a brief as she's faking being a BSS agent, or BSAA agent, is the president kind of points out, like, these weapons, these seem very impractical to use in the battlefield. For one thing, they can't tell friend from foe, which is one of the great, I think is a very good point. Like, why would you use this bioweapon when you could use it, which will stick around, it will attack both your troops and your people along with the enemies. So it's not very controllable, it can easily contain, when you can use like poison gas or a virus that will just kill somebody. You can somewhat contain the spread of a virus that much more effective than this kind of creatures like these. And we can kind of see their use from a rebel terrorist point of view. They seemed like to be great, which then it goes to the point like, but we even see like the tyrants. Like, this is the most powerful tyrant I think we've ever seen. And near the end of the film, an A-10 just comes and slaughters this thing with like a split second's worth of bzz. The tyrant's just devastated. It's ripped up. missile takes out the other one. Hell, they even have one scene where they take a BMP, which I'm sure a lot of people that aren't up on military things are going to think it's a tank. No, believe me, this weapon, even though it looks a little tank-like, is not considered a tank. It's way too weak. Its gun is way too weak. It looked like a BMP-3, which, granted, does have a little bit more of a powerful gun than a BMP-2 or a BMP-1. But they kind of ram one of the tyrants, and he actually, hilariously, he smacks the tyrant a couple times with the gun cannon, and eventually he's able to shoot it once with the cannon, and it shows one shot with with this light infantry fighting vehicle kills that tyrant. Kind of implying, if you threw these guys on a battlefield, they're, after the shock value wears off, they're not that great. So you're investing how much money in these things, and they are not. They're useless. It's kind of like, well, Umbrella, what were you playing? You were building all this money, you're investing all this thing for a weapon system that doesn't seem to really deliver. Again, terrorists, this looks like a great weapon for a terrorist. I mean, you can release a few of these things, they'll cause devastation, but you don't, the terrorists themselves can get away. So I think it was a good little. I mean, they kind of did the same thing with the zombies in Degeneration. They had that scene where they kind of had the troops just kind of go in, and they were just in lines. They're very coordinated. They just go down the corridors of the airport and just kill all the zombies. Because kind of once you know how to handle a zombie, and you're briefed properly, and this time they actually seem to listen to Kennedy when he says to shoot them in the head. Their zombies and gondos are not that hard to take down by an organized military force. And I guess that's secretly what the director kind of wants to point out. It's like, no, these things can be taken out once you know what they are. And I do like that about the film. So, I mean, I said a lot of complaints about this film, but I do enjoy it. A lot of the complaints, again, I were pointing out, were kind of, I think, more story elements. But I do like seeing the one where you get to see the bioweapons as they should be used. They're used now in an actual war. We're seeing their implications. We get to see Kennedy, Leon, in probably more traditional spy and agent stuff. And like I said, I like this film a lot more than I liked Degeneration. Well, I mean, not a lot more, but I liked it. It's nice to see it in canon, and there's a few things I question, but I know. Looks like Capcom really wanted everything to be pushed out for Resident Evil 6, and I'm very curious if this does tie into Resident Evil 6. So some of my complaints, I think I'm going to hold off. I mean, I could make a few additionals, but I have a feeling that they might come into play in Resident Evil 6. The only other complaint is they said this was like this was a true sequel to Degeneration, and it's not. It really doesn't have anything to do with the previous plot, other than that Kennedy's in it. There is nothing from the first CG film, that translates to this. If this was taking place, there was that dictator in the first Degeneration that was sponsoring these attacks as for tests. If they had shown that this, like if they wrote the script a bit so that maybe Kennedy was infiltrating that Eastern Slav was ruled by General, what's his name, Gondo or something like that, that would have been better. Then I would have been, see, this is happening right after Degeneration. They know who's sponsoring this. He's obviously trying to acquire bioweapons. We've got to see what's going on. There's a civil war going on in this country. It would have worked a lot better. And that's why I think there was some rewrites. As I think originally this was written with that plot thread that tied the two together. So I will criticize them as kind of doing a little bit of bullshit by saying this is kind of a real sequel to Degeneration. No, this is just another movie with Kennedy in it that takes place in the Resident Evil universe. Granted, it is in canon, unlike the live action films. But I've gone on now for 45 minutes, long video. I do apologize, although some of you guys seem to really prefer the long videos. And I guarantee you no one else has gone on for 45 minutes about Resident Evil Degeneration on YouTube. You doubt me? Fine find me someone that ranted longer on that about this movie. Although now that I've said that, watch, Phalis is going to do like a 46-minute review. Although he's technically on Blip. His stuff is originally on Blip. So, even if you transfer it over to YouTube, I'm still technically right. Even though I'm not. Well, signing off for now, guys. Check out this movie if you can. Not sure what the next review is going to be. I might go see Looper, I might not. I heard it's good, though. But we'll see what else comes out. Signing off.